a little more in depth. And this kind of sets that up a little bit. One of the things I mentioned on this next assignment is that it's, by and large, the concept itself is kind of simple. I mean, find a personal utopia and illustrate that. But it needs, every layer needs to animate, and it needs to loop as well. So if it's a 10-second animation, when it gets to the end, it's going to start over again, and it's going to seem seamless when it does so. And there are certain ways to kind of try and make that happen. So the basic loopings that I've got, that I was going to start with, the concept of looping, I'm going to create a new composition real quick. And I'm doing these at 1080 square because the math is simple. And you don't have to do a lot of math with it, but knowing what you have to work with is kind of important. So I've got this composition here, and I want to go into my settings real quick and make sure that, so it's set to 10 seconds. Whenever we want to loop, the idea is that we want to do as little work as possible to set up the loop, and we want to make it in such a way that we can adjust the timing of that loop to speed up or slow down in a simple kind of a way. And while we can, over the course of 10 frames, we could animate, we could move an object from point A to point B and duplicate it, stair step it. That'll work. It's also not very flexible, So under that scenario, if I had, I've got a simple red ball. The idea in a loop is that where it starts and where it ends are identical so that they match up as they cross and loop back around. So I've got this red ball, and I can take that, and I want to set its, actually I want to center the anchor point to the object. And I'm going to make sure that that is set at, on my position layer, that very first number is your XY coordinate. I want to make sure that's set to 0. Or I could actually I'll pull it off, set it right back about here. I'm going to move ahead 2 seconds. Actually, come back here, set a keyframe. Move ahead 2 seconds and slide it across here. So in a very manual sort of method of doing this, I could take that, I can duplicate it. Maybe I offset this halfway, duplicate it again. I'll set that to 2 seconds. And I can create a kind of a loop that does that. But like I said, the only issue with that is that it's not very flexible. I need to change that timing, and I've got to do an awful lot more work to it. So, actually, I'll just call this a static loop. So what I'm going to do instead is create a new composition. Create my red ball like I had before. Make sure that my center point set to the middle, and position, and I'll set that to 0. And then I'm actually going to create multiple copies of this ball in order to loop this. So and we'll do that again. I confused it. Let's continue. All right. All right, so that's where I was. That's not going to work. Let's send. All right, do a new file. I inadvertently deleted the name of the file, and After Effects didn't like that, so. Or deleted the name of the layer. All right. We'll just start with a fresh one. All right, 10 seconds. All right. And set up that ball again. Transform, center anchor point to the object. And then position. And set that to 0. All right. So now that's where I want it. So I'm going to take that and I want to duplicate it. And I want to place the other copy on the other side of my composition. So position this. It's a 1080 composition, so I'll just set that dimension to 1080. And I'm going to actually parent those together. So this is going to be my the main ball, because that's the one I'm actually going to animate. All of these, the other ones I'm going to create here are just to help me sort of fill the gaps. So go over here under parent link, use that little pick whip, drag it down on top of this main. And now if I go ahead and I just manually, I'm going to set a keyframe on this. And then come out to 2 seconds. And I'm going to move this. So what I want to do is move it from the left side of the screen to the right side of the screen. So I'm just going to do 1080. And that'll move. But the problem with this is that when I get to the end of, this is actually going to be the entirety of my loop. But the problem is that this side doesn't match this side whenever I started. So if this is the way it started, this is the way that's the same way that it needs to end, all right? So I'm going to take this shape layer and I'm going to duplicate it again. But what I want for this one is that I want it to be over here on the left-hand side, so that as I animate that across, I've got 2 end frames that are identical. So position, and I'll set that to, since we're working with 1080 width, I'll set this to minus 1080. Right? That doesn't look right. That's not right. Let's do this. Oh, I need unparented, that's why. Now let's do that. Take that. We're gonna go. There we go, that's more like it. And then I'm gonna parent this to that main ball. And now whenever I scroll across that and I get to the other end, my start frame and my end frame match exactly. And then here, I'll just place my playhead right here at the very end. And on this position, I want to set a loop. So this is where expressions come back into play. Hold down the Option key, click on my stopwatch, and we're going to do a loop out expression, which is basically going to repeat or cycle the movement that I just created. So there are two different types of loop outs. There's, by default, if I just type loop out, the default behavior on a loop out is just a cycle, which basically means that whatever the action is from point A to point B, it's just going to repeat that action. The second one is the ping pong, which actually is like ping pong. It starts, you start on one side, you go to the other end, and then it runs it backwards and keeps ping ponging it back and forth. So we're just going to use a regular loop out. If I want to specify the action within these parentheses on loop out, I'm just going to hit double quotes and I'll type cycle. But that's the same as the default behavior. If I wanted to ping pong, I type ping pong in there. Basically, these expressions are just JavaScript that After Effects understands. So if you've ever done any web type of stuff and had to work with JavaScript in any way, it's somewhat similar, but it's got its own set of functions and rules. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll this back. And now if I play this, it's going to seamlessly loop across. And when I get to the end of my 10 seconds, it's going to keep going. Part of that is because of the way I timed it out. I set this animation to 2 seconds, this loop to 2 seconds, so 2 evenly divides into 10 seconds, which is the total length of my animation. If I would have set, I can change the speed of this by, we'll move back to 1 second here. I'll grab my end keyframe, slide this back to 1 second. And speed that up. It's just basically doubling the number of iterations from the very beginning to the very end. So long as I time it so that the beginning matches the end, it's going to loop, it'll loop endlessly. And I can make that last as long as I want. Most of the time, we don't really, usually with icon graphics, that kind of thing, we'll want a steady loop that never really stops. Most of the time, we'll just set up loops to kind of fill out our timeline and don't really worry about whether it plays back over after it reaches the end or not. But with this particular assignment, we're going to do that. So that's the basic of setting up that loop. And I can do, so I could take that and that'll work within that composition. I could add another sphere in the middle of this. I just want to make sure that, actually, let's do that. I'm going to duplicate this again. Let's unparent it. And then this one I'm just going to manually kind of slide over here and duplicate it and slide it back over here. Take both of those, loop them there. And that speeds up that illusion of movement as well. I place them closer together. I'll shorten this up going forward because 10 seconds is still a little bit long. And actually that didn't quite match up. I know what I did wrong. I really should plan out the entirety of what I want to do before I go and make changes to it. I do that. So one of the items that I uploaded to Canvas was, there we go. I have a couple of things. I have a city and a wheel. So I want to move this wheel. Actually, I'm going to create a comp out of this wheel. If we take a quick look at that, it's just a wooden wagon wheel kind of a thing. And what's that? So I'm going to select this, and if I right click on it, I can make a comp from that selection. It's one of the options, and all it's going to do is create a comp. And if I open it up, it's got the wheel inside of it. So if I want to loop this so that it continually turns, basically it's going to do this, loop over and over again. The process on that's fairly simple, and it again uses that loop out function expression. So I'll leave this at 10 for now. So this time I'm going to loop the rotation value of it. So if I select that wheel and I tap R on my keyboard, I can start it here, and I'll come across to 5 seconds and see what I get. Come across to 5 seconds, and a full rotation of a circle is 360 degrees, right? So I'll rotate that 360 degrees, which looks identical to 0 degrees. So if I play that through, okay, so an interesting thing. So when I had this set to 5 seconds, No, maybe it was just looping, lagging. You can hit, there we go. So when I had that set to 5 seconds, over the course of 5 seconds, that loop of 360, that rotation of 360 degrees matched up exactly on every frame for every spoke. So it doesn't look like my wheel's moving at all, which is rather ironic that it happened that way. But if I slide this off to 4 seconds, slide it back to 2 seconds. Let's try that. So we're going to do 360 degrees over a second. That gives a nice kind of a slow rotation. So like I said, the problem, the only issue here is that because my first frame and my last frame are identical, 360 degrees and 0 degrees look the same, when I get to the end of this, if I loop this, I'm actually going to have 2 identical frames back to back, and it's going to appear as a hiccup. So if I select this keyframe, oops, and set my cycle, so I'm going to loop out. What did I do? Let's clear my cache. Oh, I know what I did wrong. Let's undo the expression. Set my rotation. And set this to 360 degrees. There we go. So now, with that, if I set that to loop out, that'll keep going. So the nice thing about setting that loop up in a separate composition is that now actually when I get this to the end, it's not going to quite match up because keyframe. Pull that back 1 frame. And when I get to the end, it should just, it picks right up and loops back over. Because those 2 frames are identical at the beginning and the end, what was happening was it wasn't matching up at the very, very end here because it was a frame off over the course of 5 different rotations. So when you set that loop out on a rotation, you always take your keyframe and back it up 1 position so that it's positioned just before 360. Since 0 and 360 are identical, it'll pick up in the right spot the next time through. Does that make sense? So I've got my wheel comp, and I can go back in here into my original one then, drag that in, and I can scale this to whatever size I want. And let it just rotate and spin. And the combination of these 2 loops, I've got this just rotating in the middle, but I've got these, the red balls sort of moving past in the background, gives it the sense that it's traveling through a space. So the concept is all the same with, if you've got a landscape and a car traveling on a road, the concept is the same. By using both of these different loops, we can, even though this is stationary, we can give it that sort of illusion of moving through space. And I can take that and create a surface for it to drive on. And I can create different kinds of motions that way. I could create another object that, let's add another one in here. Deselect everything. Maybe I've got posts of some kind. I'll set that off a little bit. Duplicate that. Position it. Center that anchor point to the content. There we go. So it's setting about, I'll make this easy, set it at 150. And then we can, maybe what I'll actually do is pull this off to 0. Take this one, move it to 1080. Maybe instead of this, maybe I'll do 1080 is actually 10 to 2160. Center points keep moving around on me. This one, there we go. Back to 0. I'll take this and set it off to that. Position it. We'll set this to minus. see how this works out. This one, because we're not evenly spacing it, is going to work a little bit differently. I'm going to have that be my main one. Parent goes to that. And then if I take this and move it to, let's see, at 5 seconds. Keyframe for that. Probably didn't need that other one. Here, we'll set that back to 0. Now here, we want this one actually to be a little further along. 22, let's see, 42, 43, 40. Nope. Wrong one. Bless you. Actually, we'll just move this one off to this position so that they're kind of staggered. And then loop that out. Let's see if that did what I wanted it to do. Not really. You got to kind of plan those fronts and ends out. I kind of did that one off the cuff, and it didn't work out. So we can set up loops, to make it look as though we're moving from point A to point B, even though we're still pretty stationary. Those. Like I said, most of the time we haven't really looked at used loops to kind of to loop continuously on replay. We just get it from point A to point B, and that's all we really care about. So it's kind of the other end of that. So let's save that. So that can set up sort of a parallax motion and a different animation motion from layer to layer, working in a left to right kind of a process. We can also go front to back. And so there's two things we're going to look at there, and we're going to set up a file. I think we may not do anything. We're going to set up a file, but we probably won't do anything with it until next week, I think. Depends on what kind of time it takes. But two of the other things I wanted to show you are create a new comp. So After Effects has, in all these different items that you have to select from, add your scene, one of the items is a camera. So we just work in a traditional 2D space for the most part, but a camera brings kind of a third dimension into it so that you can actually pull objects closer to you and away from you, apply depth of field, and that sort of thing. So if I want to create just a couple of simple shapes. And center that. Duplicate it. So I've got two shapes that are identical in size. This one I'll make blue so we can see the difference easy. Two shapes are identical in size. And all right. So I'm going to add a third element to my scene. Add a camera. So this is going to introduce sort of a third dimension into what we're doing. It's not, again, it's not true 3D, it's 2.5D, because we're still working in a two-dimensional workspace, but it will give the illusion of moving things forward and away from us, towards and away from us. And you can pair cameras up with 3D software. Cinema 4D has actually a strong integration with After Effects. So you can create a Cinema 4D 3D file, import it, link the assets into After Effects so that when you render in 3D, the assets come into After Effects and you can utilize those in your scenes as well. We're not going to do that, but we're just going to use just look at a very simple camera to start with, just to sort of show how it works. And it's got a bunch of presets. You can set, if you know much about videography or cameras, you can set different focal lengths on your lenses. Just a bunch of different settings. I'm just going to select the default ones for now, say OK. And it'll always give me a little warning. So if I'm going to use a 3D camera, I've also got to turn on 3D layers for all my objects in my layer. And so here's my main camera. If I, just to look at this real quick, on my down here in my layer options, there's a little cube that sits on the very end of this set, and if I turn on those cubes, that'll turn on, that'll give me, instead of just an X and a Y movement for each of my objects, it'll add a Z movement, which is forwards and back. So slide that down out of the way. And for each of these two objects, here's that little 3D icon. I'm just going to turn on 3D. And you might remember these from whenever I did that frame spinning. I spun it in 3D space. So this now gives us, we've got our X and our Y movement, and we're now going to have a Z movement that we can work with. And the nice thing about camera is that we no longer have to be constrained just to this viewport. If we come down here, we're using the active camera, which is camera 1. Classic 3D, which is After Effects version of camera. Over here, there are views. So I've got one view selected now. I'm going to switch it to 4 views. I get 4 views on my camera. My regular viewport, which is through the camera lens, if you will. A top view, a front view, and a right side view. So if I select my blue sphere now, remember we're working in a 3D space. I'm going to select my blue sphere, and I'm going to come over here to my top view, grab this and pull it forward. And you see how that reacts in my main camera view. It starts to give me sort of that, it pulls it closer to me. If I push it back, it moves back away from me. So I can move objects in 3D space that way. So I could pull this out here so that I don't see it. Position, I'll set a keyframe on it. Come out here 2 seconds. Got to kind of zoom back on this. Oops. If I hold down the space bar, I can pan around my viewports. Hold down my space bar. Now I'll slide this back. And I can set up that kind of dimensional movement that I haven't really been able to do before. If I was going to do this in 2D space, I would just kind of move, you know, take my sphere and I'd scale it up, pull it off the screen, set another keyframe, put it, scale it all the way down, move it to a different point of my screen, and I could create a similar kind of effect 2-dimensionally. But the camera lets me actually do that within 3 dimensions. The other thing that's kind of nice about the camera is that if I come down here, if I double click on the camera, look at my settings, I have enable depth of field set. It will actually incorporate depth of field into the scene through the camera. So if I drop, I'm not sure 100% exactly what the measurement needs to be, but, oops, that was my focal distance. Focal length. Blur level. You kind of adjust your blur settings through the f-stop aperture and blur level. So if I crank this way up, there we go. You'll see that it starts to blur that object. What it should do, hold down my space bar. septum. Grab my space bar. Grab this blue shape again. So as it gets further away from me, it's blurry. As it gets closer to me, it comes into focus. And as it gets real close to me, it blurs out again. So it kind of hits that depth of field mark. And I can still couple that with actually back here, since I blurred that out, it kind of increased the size of it. So I need to select that. Pull this forward a little more so it's entirely out. And there. Get rid of that keyframe. And I could incorporate maybe from about here some opacity. So it's 100% there, but as it gets further back here, say to that point, I can drop my opacity off to zero. And now when I play that, it kind of goes away and disappears into space. And there's another item that if I place my playhead right there, my position I can loop out, and it should give me because I did not left my opacity to 0, and I'll want to loop that as well. Loop it out. Now let's see if that does what I want it to do. There we go. So we can loop that forward and back movement as well. And over here it's getting kind of funky. I think it has to do with the way I set my opacity up. I should probably actually try that. I don't know, sometimes you try to combine certain things and they don't behave wholly as you expect them to. A little glitchy, but so that's something we can do with a 3D camera. So there are also all sorts of kind of creative ways to use 3D cameras and different 2D shapes and the 3D axis tools. You can create, using this, you can create the illusion of like a book opening on screen using just various different setups. But they are fairly flexible and kind of fun to play around with a little bit. It just adds an extra layer. To be honest, don't use the 3D camera a whole lot. I do on occasion, but most of the things when I'm animating two-dimensionally, I'll just keep in 2 dimensions. You know, I can do that exact same process by I can create that exact same process pretty much by setting a scale. Actually set scale and position, both. I'll do a 3. Scale this down. And the combination of scaling and changing my position creates the same kind of effect. You know, so as you're considering looping your objects, you know, consider you don't have to always go left to right. You can go forward and backwards as well. So you've kind of got all those dimensions you can work with if you want to. You're welcome to kind of take this as far as you want. But 3D camera is a nice tool to have. All right. But, so that last little bit, scaling this way, kind of takes me into this last thing. And one of the things that was up on Canvas that I asked you to download, if you want to open those up, there are 2 files, images and a spaceship project. And this kind of goes hand in hand with the lecture on Monday, with foreground, background, and that kind of thing. So if you open a spaceship project folder file and open the spaceship project, you'll see a composition. And if we kind of scrub through this or play through it, I don't know why this is so long. Let's scale this down. Play through it. This file has set up in it 3 or 4 different layers. There's a foreground, there's a middle ground, and a background. And if you watch them closely, they're all moving, but they're all kind of moving at different paces. And this is kind of set up using a different process, I think, than the process is the same as a lot of other ones I've done, but if I open up this spaceship landscape composition that's in it, you'll see that it's just a great big composition with all of our different layers in it. So we've got our sky, Saturn back there in the background. We got this middle ground of mountains, and then this foreground of the spaceship. This canvas is, in case we care, 2880 by 1920. So it's about double the size of a 1920 1080, at least double the width anyway. So it's well oversized. If we go back here into this final comp and take a look at this, it's all animated in the spaceship landscape, but then that comp is placed inside of the final composition for the 1920 1080 and basically uses that to crop it so that, you know, if I scrub through this, those are all moving. And the animation is easier to see in this one because, let's see, this goes out to what, 14, 16 seconds? We'll go to 16. And I'm going to trim this down. This is far too long. Let's do that. Let's trim that comp in the work area. All right. So if we look at this, all we've got are 3 or 4 different layers, and they all move varying amounts. And you can kind of see here, so objects that are closer to you are going to move more than objects that are further away from you, based upon your field of vision. So this foreground object, if you watch it, it's scaling the most. This middle ground is scaling somewhat less. And then our planet back here is just kind of moving left to right, and we can pretty much move him at any pace we want to based upon our composition. So he's kind of an independent one, but that's how that foreground, background, and movement is all set up. And this particular object is created out of a bunch of different pieces parts. So the other file that was in here, images, has that desert scene in it, mountains, here's Saturn, and there's a spaceship in it too. And if we take a look at in the spaceship project under footage, there's a PSD file. If we open it up, all this is a composition that's created in Photoshop on different layers. That are labeled. So That's how it's built. And then, and this is kind of the concept too of, I think I've mentioned before, sort of working backwards, starting with the composition you want to end with, and then animate backwards from that. So the PSD file has those 4 layers. And if we take a look at it in After Effects, the space landscape, there's our 4 layers. And each one of these is animated. So, and it's really just a combination of scales and positions. Could use a 3D camera with this. Might be an interesting exercise to try. But we can do this just with scaling, doing regular transforms to create this kind of effect. I think if I check the image size of this composition, yeah. So this matches the size of the composition that it was in After Effects. So let's look at setting this up, because we'll animate it next week. But the reason I put them up there was I wanted you to have access to all the elements to create a similar kind of a composition. So there's going to be, most of the rest of this will be Photoshop for the time being. So I created a variation of this. I used some of these parts and I modified it a little bit. You can use the parts exactly as they are if you want. Create the same scene. I did a slight variation on it with some different clouds and that kind of thing. But the concept is still the same though. Everybody works kind of differently. So I have a tendency to leave my masks and all of my kind of construction stuff within my Photoshop file. But what I do want to have is 4 separate layers that I can bring into After Effects. So in Photoshop, we'll build a composition, colorize it, do what we need to, and then bring that into After Effects and animate those different layers to kind of pull them towards us and sort of create some spatial kind of movement. So I'm going to make my composition the same size as what he had his. So if we do take a look at the canvas size, we were at 2080 by 1920. So I'll create a new Photoshop file, 2080 by 1920. And I'm just going to kind of start positioning stuff. So I'm going to open up let's start with the desert, because that's a nice simple kind of one to work with. Drop that onto Photoshop, open it up, and just copy all of that, and I'm going to paste it into this composition. And it's about the right width. So one of the characteristics of this scene is that if I turn all this off, because this foreground kind of disappears into that background, what we have is a softened edge on that desert. So if we go back into our main comp, I'll just place a mask layer on that, use a gradient blend, and if I hold down my shift key, that'll constrain it horizontally, and I'm just going to kind of vignette off that background to make it sort of appear as though it disappears into space or into the environment. And that layer is pretty much as simple as that, aside from the spaceship image that he had. So if I drag that back down here onto Photoshop, we'll open that. And I'm just going to do a real quick kind of isolation of this. So that fourth tool down on the Photoshop toolbar, object selection tool, and I'm just going to click on that spaceship, that red outline on it, and copy it from there, go back in my untitled composition, and we're going to paste it in here. And this original landscape, it's kind of crashed into the surface. So we'll just kind of transform that a little bit, turn it up. Maybe I'll kind of do that. And then make it look like it's sort of embedded itself into the ground. So we'll add another mask. And using the, gradient tool, wrong way. I'm just going to kind of softly embed that. And maybe I'll kind of try to position it so that it maybe looks as though I can do more around this, bring up, maybe I'll go down here to my foreground, grab my lasso tool, and maybe I'll grab this little bit. Copy that. Pull it up here. Transform it, scale it down a little bit. Just something to make it kind of look as though it's sort of embedded into that ground. Soften the lower edge of that. And when we get that kind of the way we want it, kind of compare it to the original. Deselect my mask and embed that a little bit more. And we get that kind of the way we want it, all we really need to do is color correct it. So I have a tendency when I color correct, like I want this to sort of take on tones of this overall environment. I have a tendency just to sort of build up layers until I get effects that I want. I don't really have one I guess I kind of have go-to ways of doing that, but if I add, say, maybe we'll look at color balance first. By option click, I can parent that to that bottom layer. And we can try to kind of warm that up. It's very blue right now. And as we kind of adjust that color balance, actually, that's pulling it. It's not too terrible. So that kind of blends those together. And we get that pretty much, that's our entire foreground part. So I'm going to leave that at that. Select all of those, and I think I'm actually going to convert those to a smart object. I'm not 100% sure if I can take a smart object into After Effects, but we're going to try. If not, I'll come back and I'll flatten the layer. So there's my first one, kind of adjusted the color. I think I'm going to go grab my sky next. I'm going to use a different sky that I've got. Copy that. Here into my comp, paste it, drop it back behind. I kind of like this image just because it already has a little bit of the coloring in it that I kind of wanted, and I really like that kind of teal contrast to that really warm foreground, just to give some real kind of sense of depth, which isn't far off from the other one had that teal color too. This one's just a little more vibrant, which I kind of liked. So just scale that up so it fits. And be in the habit of naming all your layers. Just helps find things, it makes finding things easier. So I'm going to go grab Saturn next. I'm not even going to outline this because I'm just going to copy that, paste it back in here, and we'll paste it above the sky. Scale that up a little bit. If it gets a little soft, that's all right. But in order to sort of blend this in, so I'm going to use a blending mode to blend that in. I'm just going to use screen because it's going to take those light areas and sort of lighten up that sky, but the black is going to go away entirely. And it gives us that kind of look that we want, as though it's way off in the distance and you've got that atmospheric interference with the quality of the image. So we'll just sort of place that and scale that up a little bit more. You've obviously got to be kind of careful with scaling images, just because if you scale them too big, they get soft, kind of pixely. But I think for what we're doing here, especially since we're blending it in, it's going to work out fine for that. And our last part is our mountains. And this is probably going to take the most adjustment. So I'm just going to do a quick isolate with this. Create a mask for it, and then fill in the areas that it didn't grab here at the bottom. I'll just apply that. Actually, I think because it's a little further back, I think it's got kind of a soft edge on it. I might want to feather that edge, that mask edge, just a little bit more. Not that much. Soften that just a little bit. And then I'm just going to go ahead and apply that mask so that I can then take all of this, copy it, and go back over to my composition and paste that in. So it's going to be in front of Saturn, behind my foreground, and this one we're going to have to scale up some. Kind of like that. Bring that down. And we're going to need to color correct it to sort of make it blend in with the rest of our scene. Position-wise, that's probably okay for now. And then I'll just kind of start off with a color balance, see what I get. I want to link it. If I hold down the Option key and click right between those two layers, I can link this color adjustment only to that mountain range. And we will just kind of adjust our color a little bit. And I think I'll add another adjustment layer to that. It's kind of heavy. It's like my crashed spaceship is sort of blending into it. Let's try brightness and contrast. Maybe maybe that's what might work well on that. I just kind of build up layers as I go. I mean, until I get it where I want it. Maybe I'll add a solid color that's kind of like that. See what I get with color. I think, except for the fact that I don't. Let's sample one of these colors. Sampling colors out of other elements from within your scene is a good way to kind of get things to blend. So that actually looks a little bit better. I could dial that down a little bit. I think I'm going to leave it up though. I just want it to have that kind of overall sort of warm Mars kind of a tone to it. And when I finish up with all of that, I'll take all of those and I'm going to create a smart layer out of those as well. Convert to smart object. So if you don't know what a smart object is, they're kind of nice because it creates, basically it took all of those, it's a very non-destructive way of working. The one thing and like I said, I haven't tried to bring a smart layer into After Effects. We're going to do that. If it doesn't work, the worst thing that happens is I've got to come back and flatten these. Not that big a deal. But the one thing that, like in contrast, these are all pretty much set. You know, if I need to make an adjustment or a change to it, I can't do that. I like being able to work non-destructively as opposed to destructively. And this is somewhat destructive. Only, and it's a common way of doing it. I just do it differently is all. When I create smart objects, what's nice is all I got to do is double click on the smart object and it opens up just that particular object. I can make whatever changes and modifications I want to this. Maybe I change this to something a little more orange. Save it. Close it. I come back here and it updates into my original composition. So if now let's see if I can get this color back to where I had it. Maybe pretty close anyway. That. Too many layers. All right. So, you know, I can go back in. I can still modify this foreground as much as I need to, but I'm going to go ahead and save this as so I've got all my layers set up. Maybe the only other things I want to do is probably should be a little bit of atmospheric perspective in this. That's kind of harsh. Maybe I could sample a color of my sky. Go back into my smart object and add a layer above, parent it, and do a foreground to transparent that kind of just does that. Just kind of, and then if I go back here, it kind of pulls a little bit of that sky color in there to kind of blend and create that atmospheric perspective. So for those of you that don't know, you know, manipulating these colors, that's the other way of, you can either create senses of depth with different lighter tints of colors, or by working within your layers, incorporating colors of the layer behind to sort of start blending those and making them feel as though they're part of the same composition. So it's a rather fantastical kind of a scene. But we've got all the pieces parts here. We can animate this in any number of ways we want to now. So we could, when we bring this into After Effects, we could slowly rise, Saturn above the mountain range, do any number of things. He's going to actually kind of move across the sky. And the one thing I can tell already is, at least with the background that I did, because it's different, I'm not going to like how it sort of overlaps the clouds. So I'm going to duplicate my clouds here and create another layer. And I'm just going to kind of mask out with paintbrush tool. 0 hardness. X on my keyboard. Kind of paint all this out. Right click. I can scale down my it's picking up the black from Saturn. That's what it's doing. Couldn't figure out why that was black. I forgot. So that screen that I applied to this, because there's nothing behind it now, the black is reappearing, which won't last long. It's fine. Actually, I can turn that off and it'll be less distractive, I suppose. Bring this up. Sort of finish roughly masking this out. So that I turn this back on and my Saturn layer. Now, when I bring this across, it will, as soon as I order my layers right, it'll come across the sky, but it's going to kind of disappear behind that cloud. You're not going to see it. So, and maybe I'll soften that just a little bit more. It seemed kind of harsh. Yeah, that's a little bit better. So, copy. Saturn. Foreground. Mountains are midground. And that, by and large, at least for now, is my overall scene. And I can animate all these pieces, parts, in After Effects any way I need to. If I decide I want the clouds to look as though they're slightly moving, I can do that as well. It's just a matter of how much they move over time that's going to kind of make the difference. So I would like for you to put a composition like this together for Monday. Kind of put your own spin on it if you can, so that we can animate that. All right. So you can spend the rest of class working on this. If you've still got stuff to do for your utopia, for your essay and whatnot, you can work on that. It doesn't really matter. Just for Monday, essay and a piece of art for this. All right. Oh, yeah. It helps if I make you an editor. All right, there you go. You should have it now. So let's see. I'm going to create a new composition. Or actually, a new project. I want to see if these smart layers will import or not. Don't save it. All right. Import that file. Composition, retain layer sizes. What did I get? It did. That's beautiful. I color shifted a little bit between After Effects and Photoshop. Yeah, maybe a little. That's good to know. So it does maintain those smart layers. So the nice part about those smart layers is that if I still want to, I start animating it, I see little areas I want to tweak or adjust, I come back into my Photoshop file. Maybe it turns out that my spaceship is too far one direction or another. I'll slide that over, save it. Resave my comp, and it updates into After Effects pretty seamlessly. So I can work back and forth between my apps that way, which is kind of a big, gets to be more of a big recurring kind of a theme, is being able to sort of seamlessly go back and forth between apps and sort of link them up, link up your files to be able to do that kind of stuff. So the nice thing will be is after we animate this, we'll create a 1920 by 1080 comp. Drop it into it. And I'll definitely need to make some modifications to my Photoshop file once I see how it crops, but for now, that's going to be our general scene. So.